You've probably watched videos about ancient shelters and thought you understood them, until you realize no one ever explains how some of them survived Arctic winds strong enough to snap wooden poles in half. And if you've tried piecing it together yourself, you've likely hit that wall where the diagrams look simple, but the real logic behind why these structures didn't collapse still doesn't add up. Without knowing the actual engineering that kept Arctic families alive, you miss the real story, the techniques that let an entire culture endure storms that would destroy most modern tents. This video shows you the exact structural principle that made the Sami's curved pole goati work, the ancestral trick that anchored it against 100 feet winds, and the specific problem it solved that the classic lavu couldn't. So by the end, you'll understand precisely why this design worked in an extreme climate, and you won't walk away wondering how people survived conditions that should have been impossible without modern technology. Part 1. The wind was a living beast, an invisible predator stalking the Arctic tundra. In the late autumn of 1720, near the banks of the Alta River in the heart of Finnmark, the beast was beginning to wake from its summer slumber. The air, which until October 15th had been crisp, now cut the skin with the frozen promise of winter. The pale sun barely ascended, casting a blue light over skeletal birches. For the Sami people who had established their autumn camp in this sheltered valley, every whisper of the wind was an omen, a reminder of the precarious existence their ancestors had navigated since arriving in these lands after the last great freeze nearly 10,000 years ago. Aslak knew this wind intimately. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, a dull ache that was more memory than arthritis. At 35 years old, his face was a map of life in the north, with weathered skin and deep blue eyes. He stood at the edge of the camp, a collection of conical reindeer skin shelters, the lavus, clustered like a herd of animals seeking warmth. Smoke from the central fires rose in lazy spirals before being torn apart by the growing gusts. His gaze was fixed on the reindeer herd, several hundred of them grazing restlessly, their hooves scraping the thin layer of snow in search of food. Since the Treaty of Stromstad of 1751, still decades away, borders would become more rigid, but for now, in 1720, life followed the ancient rhythm of reindeer migration, a cycle perfected since their Kamsa culture. Ancestors left their marks on these same rocks more than 8 millennia ago. His son, Kyle, barely 7 years old, huddled against his leg, the small figure wrapped in thick furs. "The wind sings a sad song, father," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper against the air's moan. Aslak placed a hand on his head. "It's a warning song, son. It reminds us we must be strong." But inside, the wind's song evoked a terrifying dissonance, a melody that transported him 5 years back to the great storm of January 22nd, 1715. A memory so vivid that the taste of ice and despair still filled his mouth. Flashback, January 22nd, 1715. The world was a white, howling whirlwind. It wasn't a simple snowstorm. It was a borga, an unleashed polar wind, with gusts that, according to the elders, hadn't been seen since the winter of 1695. Inside the family lavu, the central fire sputtered and struggled, casting dancing shadows over terrified faces. Aslak, then a young man of 30, held one of the wooden poles, his entire body vibrating with the force of the wind battering the reindeer skin cover. The skins, sewn with reindeer sinew, a technique perfected over centuries, groaned under unbearable tension. Outside, the wind didn't howl. It roared, a guttural, deep sound that seemed to emanate from the frozen earth itself. His younger sister, Lyra, 18 years old, was on the other side of the fire, her eyes wide with fear. His father shouted instructions, but his words were devoured by the din. Then it happened. A sound, not like a tear, but like dry, brittle thunder. One of the main poles, weakened by an earlier frost, snapped. The conical symmetry that had given the lavu its strength, a design dating back to the first scrithifini described by the historian Procopius in the 6th century, broke in an instant. The structure collapsed inward. Aslak was thrown to the ground, the weight of the skins and accumulated snow pinning him down. The last thing he saw was the central pole swinging wildly before falling directly toward where Lyra stood. When they pulled him out hours later, the wind had subsided, but Aslak's world had been silenced forever. The present reasserted itself with a particularly violent gust that lashed the camp. On November 10th, 1720, the beast had fully awakened. Aslak blinked, pushing away the image of his sister's lifeless face. Kyle pressed closer against him. "Let's go inside," Aslak said, his voice hoarse. "Ilara will be waiting for us." His wife, Ilara, was his anchor, with knowledge of materials as deep as any man's, a wisdom passed from mother to daughter. Inside their lavu, the fire's warmth was a welcome relief. Ilara was mending a skin, her hands moving with graceful efficiency. She looked up when they entered, and a small smile softened her features. "Dinner is almost ready. Risen was here. She's worried about the wind." Aslak nodded, brushing snow from his boots. Riston, the oldest and most respected builder, was the guardian of tradition. For her, building was a sacred pact with the ancestors, and deviating from their methods was to invite disaster. Her own family had lived in the Karasjok region, a center of Sami culture, for over 500 years, and her methods were those that had been used since then. Just then, a shout rang out from outside, followed by a loud crack. Aslak ran from his lavu, with Ilara right behind him. About 50 meters away, the lavu of a young family, the Neelas, had tilted dangerously. One of the windward poles had come loose from its position, and a section of the skin cover flapped violently, like a broken wing. The family rushed out, their faces pale with fear. Several men ran to help, fighting the wind to secure the wobbling structure. It would take hours to repair, and the family would have to shelter with others until then. It was a brutal reminder of their vulnerability. That night, as the storm intensified, the tension inside Aslak's lavu was palpable. Kyle slept, oblivious to his father's inner storm. "We can't go on like this, Ilara," Aslak said quietly, staring at the dancing flames. "We trust our lives to skins and poles that can fail. The lavu is fast. It's light for migration. I understand that. We've used it since we stopped living in Stone Age pit dwellings 4,000 years ago. But it's not enough. Not when the wind roars like this." Ilara set down her sewing. "What else can we do, Aslak? It's the way we've always lived." "No," he said, his voice gaining intensity. "It's not the only way. The coastal Sami, those who don't travel as much, build differently. They use the earth itself. They build turf, goatis, low, heavy structures that the wind can't move. I saw them when I traveled to the coast near Hammerfest in 1718. They're strong, permanent." "But we're not coastal people," Ilara replied gently. "We're mountain people. We follow the reindeer. A turf goati can't be moved. It weighs a ton." "Then I'll build one that can," Aslak declared. The idea, a silent obsession since Lyra's death, took shape. "Not a permanent turf goati," he declared, "but something in between. I'll use the curved pole goati design, lower and wider. I'll add turf blocks as ballast, enough to anchor it. but not so much that we can't move it." Ilara looked at him, seeing the old wound open in his eyes. "Rissyn will never approve. She'll say you're tempting fate, that you're scorning the knowledge of the elders who brought us here since the first Sami learned to follow the reindeer in 1500 BC. "The elders' knowledge didn't save Lyra," Aslak said, his voice breaking for an instant. "Tradition must serve life, Ilara, not the other way around. Tomorrow, after the storm, I'll begin. I'll go to the slopes where the curved birches grow. I'll find the right trees. I don't care what Rissyn says. I won't lose anyone else to the wind." Outside, the storm reached its peak, a crescendo of elemental fury. The lavu shuddered, the poles creaked in protest, but it held firm. For now. Aslak stared at the fire, but he didn't see the flames. He saw the shape of a new shelter, a low, robust silhouette planted defiantly against the Arctic horizon. A silent promise made to his dead sister, a declaration of war against the wind. The decision was made. The division in the community, like a crack in winter ice, had just formed. And with the first light of day, it would begin to widen. November 11th, 1720 would mark the beginning of his silent rebellion. A rebellion not of swords, but of wood, bark, and earth. Part 2. The storm subsided on November 12th, 1720. While the community repaired the damage, Aslak ventured into the forest, axe in hand. For him, the real battle was just beginning. Ilara watched from the entrance of their shelter with a mixture of pride and apprehension in her gaze. She knew the path her husband had chosen was fraught with difficulties, not just physical, but also social. Challenging Rissyn was like challenging the mountain itself, a force of nature, immovable and ancient. Aslak didn't head to the forests of tall, straight pines that provided poles for the lavis. Instead, he ascended the lower slopes of the surrounding hills, where birches grew exposed to constant wind. There, the trees didn't rise straight toward the sky. They twisted, bent, fighting the wind from the moment they sprouted. Their trunks developed natural, resilient curves, a wooden memory of their struggle for survival. These were the trees he sought. His ancestors had used them for goati frames for generations, a fact documented in Icelandic sagas that spoke of the tent men of the north as early as the 9th century. From November 13 to 18, Aslak worked tirelessly, selecting and felling 4 birches with the 130-degree curve he needed, a spruce for the ridgepole and a dozen wall poles. He wasn't just cutting wood, he was harvesting the earth's resilience. Meanwhile, in the camp, his absence didn't go unnoticed. Rissyn, supervising the repair of a lavu, watched Ilara tanning a reindeer hide. The old woman approached, her steps slow but firm on the snow. She was almost 60 years old, a venerable age in these harsh lands, and her eyes, though clouded by age, missed nothing. "Your man plays at being a mountain god," she said, her voice without preamble. "He thinks he can bend the wind to his will." Ilara didn't stop her work. "He believes he can protect his family," she responded calmly. "There's a difference. The difference is arrogance," Rissyn spat. "Our ancestors gave us the lavu. It's light for following the reindeer. It's warm with fire. It's strong if built correctly. It's been enough for 2,000 years, since we stopped being just hunters and became herders. And now Aslak, in his grief, thinks he knows better? He's insulting the spirits of this place." Ilara finally looked up, her eyes meeting Rissyn's without wavering. "Aslak doesn't insult the spirits. He listens to them. He listens to the spirit of the curved birch that knows how to yield to the wind. He listens to the spirit of the peat that clings to the earth to stay warm. Knowledge isn't a stone, Rissyn. It's a river. It flows and changes. Either we move with it, or we drown." The audacity of her words left Riston speechless for a moment. The old woman simply shook her head and walked away, muttering about the madness of youth. On November 20th, Aslak returned, dragging the strange curved poles, attracting everyone's stares. He chose a secluded spot for his experiment. He began construction on November 21st. First, he joined two of the curved poles at their drilled ends with the ridge pole, forming an unstable arch. Then, with Ilara's help, he raised this first arch and propped it up while joining the other two curved poles at the other end of the ridge pole. When the four poles were connected, they formed a strange four-legged structure, a wooden spider skeleton that rose to barely 6 feet at its highest point. It was noticeably lower and wider than a lavu, creating a profile that crouched against the ground rather than reaching for the sky. The next step was to place the wall poles, leaning them against the hyperbolic arch frame. This created an elongated conical structure, more like a loaf of bread than a perfect cone. The shape, which southern Sami would later call a bread box goatee, was inherently stable. Unlike a lavu's poles that meet at a single tension point at the top, the goatee frame distributed the load along the ridgepole beam and down through the four arched legs. It was an engineering principle the Romans had understood 2,000 years earlier, but here, in the Arctic, it had been discovered through observation and necessity. Once the wooden skeleton was complete, on November 25th, the phase that most fascinated and repelled observers began. Aslak and Ilara traveled to a nearby bog, a place normally avoided at this time of year. There, using long knives and wooden shovels, they cut large sheets of bark from the oldest birches. Ilara showed Aslak how to choose the right trees, those whose bark peeled off in large, flexible sheets. "Birch bark is the outer skin of the world," she explained to Cale, who watched with wide eyes. "It contains betulin. It's a wax that water can't penetrate. That's why our shoes and containers don't leak." For 2 days, they collected dozens of these waterproof sheets. Then came the peat. Near the bog, the ground was formed by layers of moss and decomposing vegetation compacted over centuries. This was the dafa, the peat. It was heavy, dense, and an incredible insulator. Aslak cut the peat into rectangular blocks about a foot thick. The work was exhausting. The peat was wet and cold, and each block weighed considerably. By November 28th, they had transported a considerable pile of bark and peat back to camp. The covering process began the next day. First, they covered the entire wooden frame with the birch bark sheets, overlapping them like roof shingles to ensure there were no gaps through which water could seep. The bark, resistant to rot and fungi, created a perfect waterproof barrier. Then, with meticulous care, they began placing the peat blocks over the bark, starting from the base and working up. They didn't build a vertical wall, but stacked the peat directly on the sloped frame. The weight of the peat held the bark in place and molded to the shelter's shape. The peat layer was almost 2 feet thick at the base, tapering toward the top. This not only provided unmatched thermal insulation, far superior to a simple layer of reindeer skin, but also added immense mass to the structure. The goatee was no longer a tent, it was a small mound, a part of the earth itself. By December 5th, 1720, the prototype was finished. It stood at the edge of the camp, a dark, earthen anomaly among the pale, elegant lavis. It didn't have the grace of the traditional tents. It was squat, heavy, and smelled of damp earth and birch. It had no stakes or guy ropes. Its own weight, calculated by Aslak at over 1,000 kilos, anchored it firmly to the frozen ground. The community looked at it with a mixture of amazement, contempt, and a secret, growing interest. Some young people, those whose own experience with storms had taught them fear, watched the construction process with a curiosity they didn't dare express aloud. The completion of the Goati coincided with preparations for the winter migration. The herd, having exhausted the valley's grazing, needed to move to the winter pastures further inland, a route their ancestors had followed since the Iron Age, around 300 AD. The community began dismantling their lavis, a quick and efficient process. The poles were tied in bundles, the skins folded, and everything loaded onto reindeer-drawn sleds. It was a symphony of movement practiced for generations. It was then that the main disadvantage of Aslak's design became painfully evident. Dismantling his Goati wasn't an option. The only way to move it was to drag it whole. Aslak had built the shelter on a base of smooth logs, a kind of integrated sled. On December 10th, he harnessed 6 of his strongest reindeer to the structure. The animals pulled, their muscles tensed, their hooves slipped on the ice. Slowly, with a groan of wood and earth, the heavy Goati began to move. It was a slow, clumsy, exhausting process, both for the animals and for Aslak. The community, already on the move, quickly left him behind. Riston watched, with a look of grim satisfaction. "Strength is useless without speed," she told one of her companions. "Winter doesn't wait for fools." Aslak, Ilara, and Kael traveled alone for 2 days, far behind the rest of the community, dragging their monstrous, unwieldy shelter across the snowy landscape. Ilara walked alongside, encouraging the reindeer, while Aslak guided the load, his body aching from the effort. It was a moment of doubt, a low point in his bold experiment. He had created a fortress, but at what cost? Had he sacrificed mobility, the very essence of his nomadic culture, for a promise of safety that had yet to be proven? As the sun set on December 12th, casting long blue shadows over the snow, Aslak observed the silhouette of his creation. Strange, heavy, defiant, and completely alone in the Arctic vastness. The real test, he knew, wasn't whether he could move it, but whether, when the time came, it would move them from despair to survival. Part 3. The journey to the winter camp in Kautokeino was a lesson in humility. The main community arrived on December 15th, 1720, and quickly established their camp. Aslak and his family didn't arrive until December 18th, exhausted. Their 6 reindeer were at the limit of their endurance, and Aslak himself felt every muscle in his body protest from the effort of guiding the heavy mass through frozen hills and valleys. The sacrifice of portability was immense. As he positioned his Goati at the edge of the new camp, he felt the weight of the community's gazes. They weren't looks of mockery, not exactly. They were looks of pity, of confirmation. They saw his struggle as definitive proof that his idea, though perhaps noble in intention, was fundamentally flawed, an impractical deviation from a system perfected by time. Riston said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was more eloquent than any words. She simply watched Aslak care for his exhausted reindeer, and in her gaze was a quiet certainty. Tradition had proven, once again, its wisdom. Nomadic life demanded lightness and speed, 2 qualities that Aslak's fortress had completely abandoned. Over the following weeks, life in the winter camp settled into its familiar rhythm. The men watched the herd, protecting it from wolves and ensuring they found enough lichen under the snow. The women devoted themselves to tanning hides, sewing clothes, and preparing food. The weather was cold but stable, a calm that settled over the land like a thick blanket of snow. The sun disappeared completely on November 28th, marking the beginning of the polar night, a period of twilight darkness that wouldn't end until mid-January. In this perpetual gloom, the community's life centered even more on the warmth and light of their homes. Aslak's Goatee was a world apart, while the Lavis, covered only by a layer of skin, lost heat quickly and required constant attention to the fire. Aslak's shelter retained heat with astonishing efficiency. The thick peat walls, now frozen into a solid mass, acted as a formidable thermal insulator. The interior was noticeably warmer, the air stiller. The central fire burned more evenly, without the drafts that plagued the lavas. Kyle, who often caught colds during winters, slept deeply, his breathing calm and regular. Ilara discovered she needed much less firewood to maintain a pleasant temperature. It was a sanctuary of calm and warmth in the midst of the Arctic cold. But this comfort had a price: isolation. Few people visited them. Entering the Goatee felt like entering a cave, an earthen and silent space very different from the airy and social atmosphere of the Lavis. Aslak had built a safe shelter, but in doing so he had subtly separated himself from the heart of his community. The first test came on January 7th, 1721. A northwest wind brought a snowstorm with 50 tau-mepsh winds. Inside the Lavis, life stopped. Families huddled around their fires, listening to the wind pounding against the skins, the poles creaking and straining. The sound was a symphony of stress, a constant reminder of the thin membrane separating them from nature's fury. Inside Aslak's Goatee, the drama was notably less. The wind passed over the low, rounded structure with a dull moan, but there were no blows, no creaking, no terrifying sensation that the walls were about to give way. Ilara and Aslak looked at each other across the fire. They said nothing, but both felt a surge of validation. The calm inside their shelter was profound, almost unnatural. Kyle didn't even wake up. Aslak approached the wall and pressed his hand against the frozen peat. It was cold, but solid as rock. There was no vibration, no sign of the battle being waged just on the other side. The storm lasted 2 days. When it finally subsided on January 9th, the community emerged to assess the damage. The camp was a mess. 2 lavas had suffered partial pole collapse and required major repairs. Almost all the others had tears in the skins or problems with stakes that had loosened in the frozen ground. Aslak's Goatee, however, was exactly as it had been before the storm, an undisturbed mound of snow. A young man named Niels, whose family Lavu had been one of the most damaged, approached Aslak as he cleared snow from his entrance. Niels had watched the Goatee's construction with silent interest. "Your house didn't move," he said, half statement, half question. "Not an inch." Aslak nodded. "The earth holds it." "My father says it's an abomination," Niels continued, lowering his voice, "but my mother spent 2 sleepless nights holding the main pole while she prayed. I think what you've done is wise." He walked away before Aslak could respond, but the seed of doubt about tradition's infallibility had been planted in a new mind. Over the following days, 2 other young men approached Aslak with questions about his construction method, about the weight, about the curved poles. It wasn't acceptance, but it was the beginning of curiosity. Riston observed these interactions with growing disapproval, seeing Aslak's influence as a slow poison infiltrating the next generation. But a new fear would soon eclipse the controversy over Aslak's shelter. On January 20th, 1721, a highly respected elder named Ula, the community's storyteller, fell gravely ill. His breathing became wheezy, and a high fever consumed him. The community turned to their Noidi, their shaman, a man named Einar. Einar was a link to the spirit world, an interpreter of omens. He performed a ritual in Ulla's lavu, singing ancient songs and beating his ceremonial drum, whose reindeer skin was painted with symbols representing the Sami cosmos. The ritual lasted all night. The next morning, January 21st, Einar emerged from the lavu, his face grim. The community gathered around him, awaiting his verdict. "Ulla's spirit is fighting," Einar said, his voice resonating in the frozen air. "But his illness isn't the only message from the spirits. I've seen something else in the fire's smoke, in the drum's echo." He paused, and the camp's silence deepened. "A great wind is coming, a wind like we haven't seen in this generation, a wind that will uproot trees and make the mountains tremble, a wind from winter's soul, sent to test our strength, to purge our weaknesses." A murmur of fear ran through the crowd. Einar's predictions were rarely taken lightly. His grandfather had predicted the Great Famine of 1697, and his word carried the weight of history. "When will this wind come?" someone asked. Einar closed his eyes. "Soon. When the new moon, which will arrive in 7 days, is at its darkest, the sky will be without light, and the beast will be unleashed." The date was January 28, 1721, a day now marked with impending dread. The news spread like wildfire, infusing palpable fear into every heart. Ulla's illness became an omen of the coming calamity. People began to prepare, but how does one prepare for a wind that can uproot trees? They reinforced their lavas as best they could, adding extra ropes, piling extra snow around the bases. But everyone knew these were futile measures against the force Einar had described. Amid this growing panic, all eyes turned to Aslak's strange earthen shelter. It was no longer just a curiosity or an eccentricity, it became a symbol. For some, like Ristin, it was the epitome of the arrogance that had provoked the spirit's wrath, the weakness the wind was coming to purge. For others, a growing and silent number, it became a possibility, a tacit question. Could that squat fortress, that abomination of earth and wood, be their only hope? Aslak's Goati was no longer just a shelter. It was a dividing point, a catalyst of fear, and a desperate, fragile possibility of salvation. As the days shortened toward the new moon, the community waited, caught between the tradition they feared would fail and the innovation they didn't dare trust. Part 4. On January 28, 1721, a heavy darkness and an unnatural calm seized the camp. The herd clustered together, nervous. Inside the lavas, a terrifying silence reigned. Ulla, the elder storyteller, had died that morning, his passing the final sign, the end point of Einar's prophecy. The camp held its breath. The wind's first whisper came shortly after noon. It wasn't a moan, but a low, sharp hiss, like a serpent's. Within minutes, the hiss became a growing roar. And then the Borga struck. It wasn't a gust. It was a solid wall of force, an impact that shook the earth. The winds, which had been measured by Danish observers on the Norwegian coast in similar early 18th century storms as exceeding 90 miles per hour, struck the camp with apocalyptic fury. The snow didn't fall. It flew horizontally, a white, blinding cloud that erased the world. Visibility dropped to 0. Each lavu became an isolated island in an ocean of chaos. Inside Ristin's lavu, the experience was terrifying. The wooden poles, which had withstood storms for decades, bent and groaned as if alive and dying. The reindeer skin cover flapped and pounded with the force of 1,000 drums. The central fire went out almost immediately. The draft entering through every seam was too strong. They were plunged into almost total darkness, broken only by the fleeting flashes of the blizzard's lightning. Ristin, the stoic guardian of tradition, found herself praying, her hands clutching the main pole, her entire body an extension of the shelter fighting for its life. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of howling wind, creaking wood, and the incessant pounding of ice chunks. In Aslak's Goati, the contrast was surreal. The sound of the wind was present, a deep, dull roar that vibrated through the ground, but it was distant, muffled by the thick walls of peat and snow. There was no creaking, no violent pounding. The structure was motionless, a rock in the midst of a furious torrent. The fire burned with unsettling calm, casting a warm, steady light on the faces of Aslak, Ilara, and Kale. Kyle slept in his mother's arms, his sleep disturbed only by the dull noise of the outside world. Aslak stood, his hand resting on the inner wall. He could feel the storm's vibration, the immense energy unleashed outside, but his shelter didn't yield. It absorbed the wind's fury, its weight and aerodynamic shape, deflecting the force rather than confronting it. Every principle he had incorporated into his design, from the hyperbolic arches to the peat's mass, was working in perfect harmony. It had worked. The storm worsened. Around 3 in the afternoon, the first lavu collapsed. A sharp, tearing sound, barely audible above the wind's roar, marked its end. Another followed, and then another. They were like trees falling in an invisible forest. Inside his shelter, Aslak heard these sounds with a growing sense of dread. His personal victory felt hollow in the face of the catastrophe unfolding around him. His community, his people, were out there at the mercy of the beast. It was then that a different sound cut through the din. A scream. Human. Desperate. It came from the direction of Risten's lavu. Aslak looked at Ilara, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent understanding. "Stay here. Close the door behind me," he said, his voice firm. He wrapped himself in his thickest furs, tied a rope around his waist, and gave the other end to Ilara. "If I haven't returned in 10 minutes, don't open the door for any reason." Before Ilara could protest, he stepped out into the storm. The wind's impact was like a physical blow. It knocked him to his knees. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, and the snow blinded him. He crawled, following the lifeline that was the rope in Ilara's hand, then oriented himself by memory. Risten's lavu was only 30 paces away, but it might as well have been a world away. Fighting a wind that tried to tear the flesh from his bones, he advanced on all fours. Finally, he crashed into something, the remains of a wooden pole. Risten's lavu had partially collapsed. The structure had tilted, and the entrance was blocked by a mass of skins and snow. Aslak shouted her name, and a faint response came from inside. She was trapped. Without hesitation, Aslak pulled out his knife and began cutting through the reindeer skin. The fabric, now frozen and stiff, was difficult to cut. The wind tore the knife from his hands. But he persevered, driven by adrenaline and fierce determination. Finally, he opened a hole large enough to crawl through. Inside, in almost total darkness, he found Risten. She was pinned under a fallen pole, her leg trapped at an unnatural angle. She was conscious, but in shock. "Aslak," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The wind has come for us." "It hasn't come for you," Aslak replied, his voice a grunt of effort as he tried to lift the pole. "I have come for you." With superhuman strength born of desperation, he managed to move the pole enough to free her leg. He lifted her in his arms. She was surprisingly light. He exited the ruined shelter and began the arduous journey back, crawling backward, protecting Risten with his own body, following the rope that guided him home. Every inch was a battle. The wind fought against him, trying to snatch his precious cargo. But Aslak didn't let go. She was his sister, his father, his community, everything he had lost and everything he refused to lose again. When he finally stumbled into the Goati, he was a man covered in ice, barely recognizable. Ilara quickly closed and secured the heavy wooden door. Aslak gently deposited Ristin near the fire. Her leg was broken, but she was alive. As Ilara tended to the old woman, frantic knocking sounded at the door. Aslak opened it to find Niels and his family, their faces frozen and terrified. Their lavu had been the next to fall. Aslak ushered them in, and then more came. One by one, or in small terrified groups, the survivors of the camp, guided by the faint glow of light filtering through the Goati's smoke opening, arrived at his door. Aslak's shelter, built for 3, soon housed more than 20 people. They were cramped, frightened, but they were alive. They were safe. The storm raged for another 4 hours, but inside the Goati a strange calm reigned. Fear had been replaced by silent awe. They watched the structure protecting them, the creation of a man they had ridiculed. Ristin, with her leg splinted, lay near the fire, her eyes never leaving Aslak. There was no gratitude in her gaze, not yet. It was something deeper, a fundamental reevaluation of everything she thought she knew. The wind that had come to purge weakness had revealed instead a new form of strength. At dawn on January 29, 1721, the storm finally subsided. The wind calmed, leaving a silence that buzzed in the ears. Aslak opened the door to a transformed world. The camp had disappeared. Where there had once been a community of lavas, there were now only mounds of snow and the shattered remains of poles and skins. It was a scene of total devastation. But then, people began to emerge from the Goati, blinking in the pale dawn light. They were all there, every man, woman, and child. No one had been lost. They stood in silence, contemplating the destruction of their homes, but with the overwhelming understanding that they had all survived. They turned as one to look at the low, dark shelter that had saved them. And then they turned to look at Aslak. In that moment, Ristin, supported by 2 young men, approached him. She bowed, a gesture of profound respect that hadn't been seen in decades, and said, her voice clear in the frozen air, "You have taught us a new song, Aslak, and it is a song of strength." Part 5. The devastation was total, but the community's spirit, forged in the overcome catastrophe, hadn't been broken. On January 30th, 1721, under Aslak's guidance, the reconstruction of something new began. Ristin, with her leg still healing but her authority intact and now redirected, was the first to speak. "Aslak's knowledge saved us," she announced to the assembled community. "But our ancient knowledge must not be discarded. We must weave the new threads with the old to make a stronger rope." And so they did. Under the dual direction of Aslak and Ristin, the community not only built more Goatis, they improved them. Ristin, with her encyclopedic knowledge of nomadic life, suggested ways to make the shelters more modular, easier to transport in sections. Aslak, in turn, listened and adapted his designs, incorporating traditional binding techniques and wood selection that made the frames even more resistant. It became a synthesis of innovation and tradition. The young people, who had previously looked on with skepticism, now worked with renewed fervor, learning from Aslak the principles of mass and aerodynamics, and from Ristin the rituals and reasons behind each material choice. By the spring of 1721, the camp was a completely new vision, a community of low, robust shelters, firmly rooted to the earth, each one a testament to their people's resilience. News of the great windstorm and the miraculous survival of Aslak's community spread along the migration routes of Sapmi. In the summer of 1722, delegations from other Sidas arrived to see the new shelters with their own eyes. Aslak, now a respected leader, shared his knowledge freely, explaining the principles of his design to anyone who asked. The innovation spread, not as a replacement for Lavu culture, which remained essential for quick hunting trips and summer migrations, but as a vital addition to the Sami survival repertoire. The modified turf goati became the standard for winter camps, the bulwarks against the Arctic's worst furies. In the following decades, as the northern climate experienced cycles of increasingly severe storms, a phenomenon 21st century scientists would call the Little Ice Age, Aslak's innovation was credited with saving countless lives. The records of the churches of Kautokeino and Karasjok, established by Danish missionaries from the 1740s onward, showed a remarkable decrease in storm-related deaths in communities that had adopted the new shelters. Aslak's legacy wasn't just structural, it was cultural. He broke the dangerous idea that tradition was immutable. He demonstrated that true tradition wasn't blind repetition, but continuous adaptation. He taught his people that the greatest honor they could render to their ancestors wasn't to copy their methods, but to emulate their ingenuity. Final scene, October 20th, 1765. The wind howled, but its song was no longer one of terror. Inside a warm goashti, an elderly Aslak, 80 years old, watched his 10-year-old grandson, Kyle, carve a small wooden peg. They were reinforcing the family shelter's frame before winter's arrival, an annual ritual that was now part of the new tradition. "Remember, Kyle," Aslak said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Every piece of wood has a story. This curved birch learned to bend so as not to break. This peat learned to cling to the earth to stay warm. When we build, we're not just stacking wood and earth. We're telling their stories and adding our own." The boy nodded, his eyes serious and focused. "Were you afraid, grandfather?" he asked suddenly. "In the great storm, were you afraid of the wind?" Aslak looked toward the fire, the flames dancing in his old eyes. A slight smile touched his lips. "I was afraid of the wind, yes, but I was more afraid of what would happen if we did nothing. Fear can be a cage, or it can be a key. It's up to you to decide which it will be." Outside, a gust of wind struck the goati. The structure didn't flinch. It stood firm, a mound of earth and memory, an enduring symbol of a people's capacity to look the storm in the face and build their own shelter against it. The camera slowly pulls back from the warm, safe interior, through the peat wall, to the wind-swept exterior. The goati becomes smaller, a small dome in the Arctic landscape's vastness, a scar of defiance on the earth's skin. The image fades, but the sound of the wind remains, an eternal reminder of the beast that still stalks, and of the human ingenuity that learned not to tame it, but to dance with it and survive.